What does it take to turn the tides of history? How does a nation rise from the depths of despair to claim its destiny? Imagine this: an entire people enslaved, their cries echoing across the sands of Egypt, their hope nearly extinguished. Yet, amidst the suffering, a story unfolds, a story of courage, faith, and miracles so extraordinary that it has shaped civilizations for millennia. This is not just a tale of oppression, it's a story about transformation. A baby saved from death by the very hands of his oppressors. A man who fled his home in fear, but returned as a leader chosen by the divine. A ruler whose hardened heart unleashed chaos upon his own land. And a sea that split open, defying the laws of nature, paving the way for freedom. But here's the question: why does this ancient story still matter today? Because it's more than history. It's a lesson in resilience, a testament to the power of belief, and a reminder that even in the darkest moments, change is possible. Over the next few minutes, we'll journey together through plagues, miracles, and the birth of a nation. You'll discover how one man, one moment, and one decision can alter the course of human history forever. Are you ready to uncover the untold truths behind this epic saga? Let's dive in. What does it take to turn the tides of history? How does a nation rise from the depths of despair to claim its destiny? Imagine this: an entire people, enslaved for generations, their cries echoing across the sands of Egypt, their hope nearly extinguished. Yet, amidst the suffering, a story unfolds, a story of courage, faith, and miracles so extraordinary that it has shaped civilizations for millennia. This is not just a tale of oppression, it's a story about transformation. It's a story about how one moment, one person, and one decision can alter the course of human history forever. Let's begin at the beginning. Picture ancient Egypt, a land of towering pyramids, fertile Nile waters, and unimaginable wealth. But beneath its golden surface lies a darker truth. A new Pharaoh has risen to power, a ruler who does not remember Joseph or the contributions he once made to this mighty empire. This Pharaoh looks out over his kingdom and sees something that troubles him deeply: the Israelites. Their numbers are growing, their presence undeniable, and with each passing day, they become stronger, more numerous, and, in Pharaoh's eyes, more dangerous. Fear begins to creep into his heart. What if these foreigners, these outsiders, turn against Egypt? What if they join forces with Egypt's enemies during times of war? To Pharaoh, there is only one solution: to oppress them, to crush their spirits, and to ensure they never rise up. So, he enacts a brutal plan. The Israelites are forced into backbreaking labor, building cities, working in fields, and enduring unimaginable hardships. They are no longer seen as people, but as tools, instruments of Egypt's grandeur. But even under such oppression, the Israelites continue to multiply. Their resilience infuriates Pharaoh, and his fear grows into paranoia. He devises an even more sinister plot: the killing of every Hebrew male infant. It's a decree born of desperation, a desperate attempt to stamp out any future threat. Mothers weep in secret, fathers clench their fists in silent rage, and the air is thick with sorrow. Yet, even in the darkest moments, light finds a way to break through. In the midst of this chaos, a child is born, a baby boy from the tribe of Levi. His mother hides him for as long as she can, shielding him from the soldiers who patrol the streets, searching for infants to kill. But eventually, she knows she cannot protect him any longer. With a heavy heart, she places her son in a basket, lining it with tar to make it waterproof, and sets it adrift on the Nile River. It's a desperate act, a leap of faith, a mother's last hope for her child's survival. And then, something extraordinary happens. By divine providence, or perhaps sheer luck, the basket floats downstream and lands near the very place where Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. She sees the basket, hears the baby's cries, and her heart melts with compassion. Against all odds, this Hebrew child is pulled from the water, saved from death, and adopted into the royal family. He is given a name, Moses, meaning drawn from the water. This moment is pivotal. It's the spark that ignites a chain reaction of events that will change the course of history. Moses grows up in the lap of luxury, surrounded by the trappings of power and privilege. Yet, he never forgets his roots. He knows who he is, where he came from, and the weight of the responsibility that rests on his shoulders. Little does he know that his journey is just beginning, a journey that will lead him to confront Pharaoh, challenge the might of Egypt, and ultimately lead his people to freedom. This is a story about resilience, faith, and the indomitable human spirit. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, hope can prevail. So, as we delve deeper into this epic saga, ask yourself, what would you do if faced with such impossible choices? How far would you go to fight for freedom, justice, and the dignity of your people? Stay with me, because the answers lie just ahead. Moses grew up in the shadow of two worlds. On one side, he was raised in the opulent halls of Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by wealth, power, and privilege. He wore fine linen, dined on the finest foods, and learned the ways of Egyptian nobility. Yet, on the other side, he carried a secret, a truth that no amount of royal splendor could erase. He was Hebrew, a child of the very people his adoptive father oppressed. This duality shaped Moses in ways he could not fully understand until the day came when he could no longer ignore it. Imagine the weight of living a double life. For years, Moses walked the delicate line between his identity as an Egyptian prince and his heritage as a Hebrew. But one fateful day, everything changed. As a grown man, Moses ventured outside the palace walls, away from the gilded halls and manicured gardens. What he saw shocked him to his core. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave, his own brother by blood, though not by upbringing. The sight ignited something deep within Moses. Anger surged through him, a righteous fury born of witnessing injustice firsthand. Without thinking, without planning, Moses acted. In a moment of raw emotion, he killed the Egyptian and buried him in the sand. But actions have consequences, even for princes. When Pharaoh learned of what Moses had done, his wrath was swift and merciless. Moses, once a favored son of the palace, was now a fugitive. His life of luxury was over. With nothing but the clothes on his back and the fear of death at his heels, Moses fled into the wilderness. He left behind everything he had ever known, the only home he'd ever had, and stepped into the unknown. The wilderness was harsh, unforgiving, and vast. It was a place where survival depended on resilience and adaptability. Yet, in this desolate landscape, Moses found something unexpected, a new beginning. He settled among the Midianites, a nomadic people who lived far removed from the politics and power struggles of Egypt. There, he met a woman named Zipporah, the daughter of a Midianite priest named Jethro. They married, and Moses became a shepherd, tending to flocks under the open sky. Life was simple, quiet, and humble, a stark contrast to the chaos and grandeur of his past. For 40 years, Moses lived this way, far removed from the world he once knew. He might have thought his story had ended, that his brief rebellion against Egypt was nothing more than a youthful mistake. But God had other plans. One day, while tending his flock near Mount Horeb, Moses encountered something extraordinary, a bush that burned but was not consumed by fire. Drawn to the sight, he approached cautiously, unaware that this moment would change everything. From within the flames, a voice spoke to him. It was the voice of God, revealing himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt," the voice declared. "I have heard their cries, and I am sending you to lead them out of bondage." Moses stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he was hearing. Him, a shepherd, a fugitive? How could he possibly stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of an entire nation? Doubt clouded Moses' mind. "Who am I to do this?" he asked. "What if they don't believe me? What if I fail?" These questions are ones we all ask ourselves when faced with daunting challenges. Who am I to make a difference? What if I'm not strong enough, smart enough, or brave enough? But God's response was clear. "I will be with you." To reassure Moses further, God performed miraculous signs, turning his staff into a snake, making his hand leprous, and then healing it, and promising to send Aaron, Moses' brother, to assist him. This moment marked the turning point in Moses' life. No longer was he just a shepherd or a fugitive. He was now a chosen leader, tasked with a mission that would alter the course of history. The burning bush was more than a supernatural event. It was a call to action, a reminder that even the most ordinary individuals can be instruments of extraordinary change. As we reflect on this part of the story, consider the courage it must have taken for Moses to step forward. He didn't feel ready. He didn't feel qualified, but he trusted in something greater than himself. And isn't that true for all of us? We often wait for the perfect moment, for certainty, for assurance that we won't fail. But sometimes, the greatest acts of bravery come when we move forward, despite our doubts. So, as you think about your own life, ask yourself, what is your burning bush moment? What is the calling you've been avoiding because it feels too big, too scary, or too impossible? Because here's the truth. Every great journey begins with a single step. Moses took that step, and so can you. Stay with me as we explore what happened next, because the story is just getting started. Moses stood at the edge of a precipice, both literal and metaphorical. The burning bush had ignited a fire within him, a divine mandate that could not be ignored. Yet, as he prepared to return to Egypt, the land of his birth and the site of his greatest fear, doubt lingered like a shadow. How could he, a man who had spent 40 years tending sheep in the wilderness, possibly confront Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler of the known world? This was no ordinary mission. It was a collision of destiny, faith, and human frailty. When Moses finally arrived in Egypt, he was not alone. His brother Aaron accompanied him, serving as his voice and ally. Together, they approached Pharaoh with a bold demand: "Let my people go." These 4 words carried the weight of centuries of suffering, oppression, and hope. But Pharaoh's response was predictable, cold, dismissive, and unyielding. "Who is this God you speak of?" he sneered. To Pharaoh, the Israelites were tools, assets to be exploited, and their cries for freedom were nothing more than an inconvenience. What followed was a test of wills unlike any other, a cosmic battle between the forces of tyranny and liberation. God, through Moses and Aaron, unleashed a series of devastating plagues upon Egypt. Each plague was a direct assault on the gods of Egypt, exposing their impotence and affirming the supremacy of the one true God. The Nile, once a symbol of life and prosperity, turned to blood. Frogs swarmed the land, gnats tormented its people, and flies descended in maddening clouds. Livestock perished, boils erupted on humans and animals alike, hail destroyed crops, locusts devoured what remained, and darkness enveloped the land for 3 days. Yet, despite the mounting devastation, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. He refused to relent. These plagues were not merely acts of punishment. They were lessons etched into history. They demonstrated that power rooted in oppression is ultimately hollow. Pharaoh's empire, built on the backs of the enslaved, crumbled under the weight of divine justice. And yet, even as Egypt suffered, the Israelites watched in awe. For them, these events were proof that God had not forgotten them. Their prayers had been heard, their cries answered. Hope began to stir in their hearts, fragile but undeniable. But the final plague would leave an indelible mark on both nations. It was a night of terror and transformation. The death of every firstborn in Egypt, from the lowliest servant to the heir of Pharaoh himself. Only those who marked their doorposts with lamb's blood were spared, a sign of obedience and faith. That night became known as the Passover, a sacred remembrance of deliverance and divine protection. Finally, Pharaoh relented. Broken and desperate, he ordered the Israelites to leave. They departed hastily, carrying little more than unleavened bread and the clothes on their backs. As they fled, the enormity of what had transpired began to sink in. Centuries of bondage had ended in a single miraculous exodus, but their journey was far from over. The Israelites reached the Red Sea, only to find themselves trapped. Behind them, Pharaoh's army thundered across the desert, bent on reclaiming what he considered his property. Panic gripped the people. "Were there not enough graves in Egypt?" they cried to Moses. "Why did you bring us here to die?" Fear threatened to undo everything they had fought for. In that moment of despair, Moses raised his staff, and the impossible happened. The sea parted, revealing a path of dry ground, flanked by towering walls of water. The Israelites crossed in awe, stepping onto a road carved through chaos itself. When the Egyptians followed, the waters crashed down, swallowing them whole. In that instant, freedom became real, tangible, and irreversible. This story is more than ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting our own struggles. How often do we face moments where escape seems impossible? Where does fear threaten to paralyze us? The parting of the Red Sea reminds us that sometimes the way forward requires faith in the unseen. It challenges us to trust that even in the darkest hours, there is a path waiting to be revealed. So, as you reflect on this chapter of the Exodus, ask yourself, what seas are you facing today? What fears hold you back from taking the next step? Because here's the truth. Liberation begins when we choose to move forward, even when the waters seem insurmountable. Stay with me, because the journey has only just begun. The Israelites stood on the far side of the Red Sea, their feet planted firmly on dry ground, yet their hearts were still trembling. Behind them lay the ruins of Pharaoh's army, swallowed by the very waters that had parted to save them. Before them stretched the vast, unyielding wilderness, a landscape as daunting as it was desolate. For a moment, they allowed themselves to breathe, to marvel at the miracle they had just witnessed. But freedom, they would soon discover, was not a destination. It was a journey, one fraught with challenges, doubts, and tests of faith. As the initial euphoria faded, reality set in. The desert was no place for the faint of heart. It was harsh, unforgiving, and barren. There were no lush fields to provide food, no rivers to quench their thirst, and no shelter from the scorching sun. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and thirst parched their throats. Fear began to creep back into their minds. Had they traded one form of suffering for another? Was this freedom worth the cost? It didn't take long for murmurs of discontent to ripple through the camp. "Why did you bring us out here to die?" they cried to Moses. "At least in Egypt we had food to eat." Their words carried a bitter irony. In Egypt, they had been slaves, oppressed, beaten, and stripped of their dignity. Yet now, faced with the uncertainty of the wilderness, they romanticized their captivity. They forgot the whips, the forced labor, the cries of their children. Freedom, it seemed, came with its own kind of weight. But God had not abandoned them. He knew their needs before they even voiced them. One morning, as the dew lifted from the ground, something miraculous appeared. Small white flakes scattered across the earth like frost. The people looked at it curiously. "What is it?" they asked. Moses explained it was manna, bread from heaven, provided by God to sustain them. Each day, they were to gather enough for their needs, trusting that there would always be more tomorrow. On the sixth day, they collected twice as much, for the Sabbath was a day of rest, a reminder to trust in God's provision rather than their own efforts. Yet, even this gift became a test. Some hoarded the manna, only to find it spoiled by morning. Others went out to gather on the Sabbath, disobeying God's command. These small acts of rebellion revealed a deeper truth. Freedom requires discipline. True liberation is not merely about escaping external chains, but also about breaking free from internal patterns of fear, greed, and mistrust. Their journey continued, marked by both divine provision and human complaint. When they grew tired of manna, God sent quail to satisfy their cravings. When they were thirsty, He instructed Moses to strike a rock, bringing forth water to quench their thirst. Each act of deliverance was accompanied by lessons about faith, obedience, and reliance on God. Yet, despite His faithfulness, the Israelites struggled to trust Him fully. Time and again, they grumbled, questioned, and doubted. This tension between God's provision and human ingratitude is one of the most poignant aspects of the Exodus story. It speaks to a universal truth. We often fail to appreciate what we have until it's gone. The Israelites had been delivered from slavery, guided through the Red Sea, and sustained in the wilderness. And still, they longed for the familiarity of Egypt. Why? Because change is hard. Freedom demands responsibility, and responsibility requires courage. As we reflect on this part of the narrative, let us consider our own lives. How often do we cling to comfort, even when it comes at the expense of growth? How often do we resist change because it feels safer to stay where we are, even if that place is toxic or unfulfilling? The Israelites' journey reminds us that freedom is not a passive state. It is an active pursuit. It requires us to step into the unknown, to trust in something greater than ourselves, and to embrace the discomfort that comes with transformation. So, as you think about your own path, ask yourself, what is holding you back from stepping fully into your freedom? What fears or doubts are keeping you tethered to the past? Because here's the truth. God's provision is always enough, but it's up to us to receive it with gratitude and faith. Stay with me, because the story doesn't end here. The wilderness holds more lessons, more miracles, and more opportunities for growth. And so does your life. The wilderness was not just a physical landscape, it was a crucible, a place where the Israelites' character, faith, and resolve were tested in ways they could never have anticipated. It was here, amidst the barren sands and endless horizons, that their journey of liberation truly began to take shape. But this journey was not linear or easy. It was messy, unpredictable, and often painful. And yet, it was also profoundly transformative. As the Israelites continued their trek through the desert, God's presence remained a constant, but not always in the ways they expected. By day, a pillar of cloud guided them, shielding them from the relentless heat of the sun. By night, a pillar of fire illuminated their path, offering warmth and protection against the biting cold. These divine markers were more than practical aids. They were reminders that God had not abandoned them, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. Yet, despite these visible signs of His care, the Israelites struggled to trust Him fully. One of the most striking episodes during this time occurred at Mount Sinai, a moment that would forever define the relationship between God and His people. After months of wandering, Moses ascended the mountain to meet with God, leaving the Israelites below. For 40 days and 40 nights, he communed with the Almighty, receiving instructions for living as a free and holy nation. Among these instructions were the 10 Commandments, laws that outlined how the Israelites were to treat one another and honor their covenant with God. These commandments were not burdensome rules, but gifts designed to bring order, justice, and peace to a people learning what it meant to live as a community of freedom. But while Moses was on the mountain, the Israelites grew restless. Fearful that he would never return, they demanded something tangible to worship. And so, they crafted a golden calf, an idol fashioned from their own jewelry, and bowed before it in adoration. This act of rebellion was more than a lapse in judgment. It was a betrayal of everything they had witnessed and experienced. They had seen the plagues, crossed the Red Sea, and been sustained by manna and water from a rock. Yet, in a moment of weakness, they turned away from the God who had delivered them. When Moses descended the mountain and saw the people reveling before the golden calf, his anger burned hot. He shattered the stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments, a symbolic gesture of the broken trust between God and His people. But even in His righteous anger, God did not abandon them. Instead, He called Moses back to the mountain, where he rewrote the commandments on new tablets. This second chance was a testament to God's mercy and patience, qualities that would sustain the Israelites throughout their journey. This episode reveals a profound truth about human nature. We are prone to wander. Even when we've experienced miracles, even when we know better, we sometimes choose comfort over conviction, familiarity over faith. The Israelites' creation of the golden calf serves as a mirror, reflecting our own tendencies to seek substitutes for God, whether it's wealth, power, relationships, or success. We build idols out of anything that promises security or fulfillment, forgetting that true satisfaction comes only from aligning ourselves with divine purpose. Yet, the story doesn't end with failure. It continues with redemption. Through Moses' intercession, God forgave the Israelites and reaffirmed His covenant with them. He taught them how to construct the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where His presence would dwell among them. This structure became the heart of their community, a reminder that God was not distant or detached, but intimately involved in their lives. Every detail of the tabernacle, the materials, the craftsmanship, the rituals, was infused with meaning, pointing to the holiness and grace of the One who had chosen them. As we reflect on this part of the Exodus narrative, let us consider the parallels in our own lives. How often do we wander from the path of faith, seeking shortcuts or substitutes? How often do we doubt God's goodness when the journey feels too long or too hard? But here's the beautiful truth. God does not give up on us. Just as He forgave the Israelites and gave them a fresh start, He offers us the same opportunity. Redemption is always possible if we are willing to turn back to Him. So, as you navigate your own wilderness moments, remember this. The journey is not just about reaching the promised land. It's about becoming the kind of person who can thrive there. It's about learning to trust, to obey, and to love deeply. Stay with me, because the final chapters of this story will inspire you to keep moving forward, no matter how challenging the road may seem. Freedom awaits, but it begins with faith. The journey of the Israelites through the wilderness was not just a physical trek across barren lands. It was a profound spiritual odyssey, a process of transformation that would shape them into a nation ready to inherit the promised land. But this final leg of their story is perhaps the most poignant and instructive. It reveals both the heights of faith and the depths of human frailty. It reminds us that freedom is not merely about escaping oppression, but about becoming a people worthy of the promise. As the Israelites approached the borders of Canaan, the land flowing with milk and honey that God had promised to their ancestors, they faced one of the greatest tests of their journey, the mission of the 12 spies. Moses sent representatives from each tribe to scout the land, to assess its fertility, and to determine the strength of its inhabitants. For 40 days, these spies explored the terrain, returning with tales of abundance. Clusters of grapes so large they required 2 men to carry them, fields ripe with crops, and cities brimming with wealth. But alongside these reports came warnings of giants and fortified walls. 10 of the spies spread fear among the people, declaring, "We cannot go up against them. They are stronger than we are." Only Joshua and Caleb stood firm, urging the people to trust in God's power. The reaction of the Israelites was swift and devastating. Fear overtook them. They wept, they complained, and they longed for Egypt once again. "Why did God bring us here to die?" they cried. Their lack of faith was staggering. After all they had witnessed, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the manna from heaven, they still doubted God's ability to deliver them. In that moment, they chose fear over faith, unbelief over trust, and the consequences were severe. God declared that none of the adults who had left Egypt would enter the promised land. Instead, they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies had scouted the land, until an entire generation passed away, and a new one arose, untainted by the sins of their parents. This decision was heartbreaking but necessary. The promised land was not just a geographical destination. It was a symbol of divine blessing, a place where God's presence would dwell among His people. To enter, it required more than physical readiness. It demanded spiritual preparedness. The older generation had proven themselves unworthy, clinging to fear rather than faith. Their refusal to believe in God's promises revealed a deeper issue. They had been physically freed from slavery, but their hearts remained bound by doubt and disobedience. Yet, even in judgment, there was grace. God did not abandon His people. He continued to provide for them during their extended time in the wilderness, sustaining them with manna, protecting them from enemies, and teaching them through His laws. Each day was an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to align their lives with His purposes. Slowly but surely, a new generation emerged, a generation raised in the shadow of God's faithfulness, unburdened by the memories of Egypt and unscarred by the cynicism of their forebears. This part of the story carries a powerful lesson for us today. How often do we stand on the brink of something great only to let fear hold us back? How often do we focus on the obstacles rather than the opportunities, the giants rather than the gifts? The Israelites' failure to enter the Promised Land serves as a sobering reminder that our greatest enemy is often ourselves. Doubt, fear, and ingratitude can rob us of the very blessings we seek. But here's the hope. God's promises never expire. Though the first generation faltered, the second rose to the challenge. Under the leadership of Joshua, they crossed the Jordan River, defeated their enemies, and claimed the land God had set aside for them. Their victory was not achieved through their own strength, but through their willingness to trust in God's plan. They learned what the previous generation had failed to grasp, that faith is not the absence of fear, but the courage to move forward despite it. As you reflect on your own life, consider the promised lands before you, the dreams, goals, and callings that stir your heart. What fears are holding you back? What doubts are whispering lies in your ear? Remember this: the same God who parted the Red Sea, provided manna in the desert, and led his people to victory is with you today. He has already gone ahead of you, preparing the way. All he asks is that you take the next step in faith. So, as we close this chapter of the Exodus story, let it inspire you to press on, no matter how daunting the journey may seem. The wilderness may be long, but the promised land is worth it. Keep your eyes fixed on the horizon, your heart anchored in trust, and your feet moving forward. Freedom awaits, but it begins with faith. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness was a testament to endurance, faith, and transformation. Yet, as they finally approached the threshold of the Promised Land, their story reached its crescendo, a moment where divine promise met human resolve. This final chapter is not just about crossing into Canaan. It's about the culmination of a journey that reshaped an entire people. It's about claiming what had been promised, overcoming obstacles, and stepping into a future defined by hope rather than fear. Under Joshua's leadership, the new generation stood at the edge of the Jordan River, their eyes fixed on the land flowing with milk and honey. But before they could enter, God gave them one last test of faith. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stepped into the river, and as their feet touched the water, the flow stopped entirely. Just as the Red Sea had parted for Moses decades earlier, the Jordan now opened a path for the Israelites to cross on dry ground. This miracle was more than a practical act. It was a declaration. God was still with them, guiding and protecting them every step of the way. For the younger generation, this event became a defining moment, solidifying their trust in God's power and presence. Once across the river, the Israelites faced another challenge: Jericho, a fortified city whose towering walls seemed impenetrable. Humanly speaking, there was no way forward. But God's instructions were anything but conventional. He commanded them to march around the city once each day for 6 days, led by the priests blowing trumpets and carrying the ark. On the 7th day, they were to circle the city 7 times, and then, on God's signal, they were to shout. At that precise moment, the walls of Jericho collapsed, leaving the city defenseless. It was a victory achieved not through military might or clever strategy, but through obedience and faith. The fall of Jericho became a symbol of how God fights for his people when they align themselves with his will. Yet, even in triumph, the Israelites faced moments of failure. Shortly after Jericho, they encountered Ai, a much smaller and seemingly insignificant city. Confident in their newfound strength, they launched an attack without consulting God, and suffered a humiliating defeat. Achan, one of the soldiers, had secretly taken plunder from Jericho, violating God's command to dedicate everything to him. This sin brought consequences, not only for Achan, but for the entire community. Only after confessing their wrongdoing and addressing the breach did the Israelites regain God's favor and achieve victory over Ai. This episode underscored a critical truth. Success in God's plan requires purity and obedience. Even small compromises can have far-reaching effects. As the Israelites continued their conquest of Canaan, they faced battles, alliances, and challenges that tested their unity and resolve. Yet, through it all, God remained faithful. He gave them victories they could never have achieved on their own, establishing them in the land He had sworn to give their ancestors. Each milestone, the division of the land among the tribes, the establishment of cities of refuge, and the renewal of the covenant, was a reminder of God's faithfulness and provision. This part of the Exodus narrative carries profound lessons for us today. Life often feels like a series of battles, doesn't it? We face giants in the form of fear, doubt, and adversity. Sometimes, we're tempted to rely on our own strength instead of trusting in God's guidance. Other times, we stumble because of pride or disobedience. But here's the beauty of the story. God doesn't abandon us when we fail. He calls us back, forgives us, and equips us to try again. Victory isn't about perfection. It's about persistence. Consider your own life. What walled cities stand between you and your dreams? What fears or doubts keep you from moving forward? The story of the Israelites reminds us that breakthroughs come when we surrender control and follow God's lead. Whether it's taking bold steps in your career, mending broken relationships, or pursuing a calling that seems impossible, remember this. The same God who toppled Jericho's walls is capable of making a way where there seems to be no way. But entering the Promised Land wasn't the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The Israelites had to learn how to live as free people, cultivating the land, defending their borders, and honoring the covenant with God. Their struggles didn't disappear overnight, but neither did God's presence. He walked with them through every challenge, teaching them resilience, humility, and dependence on Him. So, as we close this epic saga, let it inspire you to embrace your own journey with courage and faith. The wilderness may have shaped you, but the Promised Land awaits. Keep marching forward, keep trusting, and keep believing. Because freedom isn't just about escaping the past. It's about building a future rooted in purpose and promise. Your story isn't over yet. Stay faithful, because the best is still ahead. As we come to the end of this journey, I can't help but reflect on the profound lessons embedded in this ancient story. What strikes me most is the resilience of the human spirit. The Israelites were not just fighting against an oppressive regime. They were grappling with their own doubts, fears, and moments of despair. And yet, through it all, they persisted. Their story reminds us that freedom, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is rarely handed to us. It must be claimed, often at great cost, with faith in something greater than ourselves. This narrative also challenges us to examine our own lives. Where do we see oppression today? Not just in the world around us, but within ourselves. Are there areas where we've become complacent, where we've accepted limitations others have placed on us? And what about leadership? Moses didn't start out as a hero. He was flawed, hesitant, and uncertain. Yet he rose to the occasion because he chose to trust in a purpose bigger than his fears. That's a powerful reminder that greatness isn't about perfection. It's about stepping forward, despite imperfection. The key takeaway here is simple, yet transformative. Change begins when we dare to believe in the possibility of a better future. Whether it's standing up for justice, pursuing personal growth, or inspiring others, every act of courage contributes to a ripple effect that can reshape the world. So now, I leave you with this challenge. Take a moment to reflect on your own Red Sea moments, the obstacles that seem insurmountable. What would it look like to trust in your ability to overcome them? Share your thoughts with someone close to you. Dive deeper into stories like this one, or simply sit quietly and dream of what could be. Let this timeless tale inspire you to write your own story of liberation.